long-timers in Carmel, or do we have new people who have never been here, who have been here for a short period of time? You do, and you're interested in the history. Well, but you could be long-timers from someplace else, so I didn't know that. I'm going to be asking 4 questions and also comments later on, because I'm sure that there are some of you who knew my father, or knew of my father, or knew the era, a lot more about the era than I did. And this is one of the things I want to preface with, is to tell you that I have done quite a bit of research fairly recently, only within the last year or so. So there are some glitches in my information, but I'm always open to new information about the symbol and about W.K. Bassett. So when I come to that point where I'm asking for comments, come up with something if you have something that I missed, or even if you find something that I made a mistake on, because that is possible. Doing historic research is very, very interesting. If you've ever done it for your family, you realize that you can find 2 or 3 different dates for the same situation. And what you usually do is you look at the source and figure, well, the Chronicle is a better source than the Podunk, Iowa something, or you also look at the source, 2 sources say one date and one source says another. You usually go for the 2 sources. So in some cases, you may have a better source than I do. So.
Well, that's okay. Now you've got 50. She's doing 24. Well, welcome again. Oops, I guess I should turn things on. Can you hear me in back? Welcome again to another Henry Mead Williams Local History Department lecture. My name is Arlene Hess, and I'm the local history librarian. I always have these little bits of housekeeping to do before we get started. I want to remind you that if you're parked in the lot immediately around the library, the police department will not ticket your car until noon, so you're home free there. And also, if there's an emergency, the emergency exits are behind you and behind me. You don't have to all try to squeeze out the side door that you came in by. I also want to remind you that these lectures and all the books in the library are made possible by the Carmel Public Library Foundation, to which I know most of you probably contribute, and we're very, very grateful for all the money that you give us so that we can have things like this. This lecture is also made possible by a grant from the Frank and Eva Buck Foundation, and that was facilitated by our good friends, Lacey and Bob Buck of Carmel. Our subject today is W.K. Bassett, the publisher of the Carmel Cymbal, which was a competitor of the Carmel Pinecone and the Carmelite during the colorful early years of Carmel. W.K. Bassett stopped publishing the Cymbal for a while in 1935, and on the last page of that issue, he wrote a poem called Fragment Found on a Tombstone, which I believe John is going to distribute later. But part of it is very, very touching. He was, I think, disturbed by all the tourism in Carmel, if he could just see it now, and the growth that he felt wasn't going the way it should. Part of the poem says, San Carlos Highway, mission word, is filled with honking cars. The cymbal's dead, the cymbal's dead. We're here to tell the stars. The scent of spring has left the air, per scent of summer comes. With dollars rolling through the town more beautiful than drums. The residents who came for peace have turned again to flee. The abalones near the shore are moving out to sea. Successful spirits gather now to sing in solemn phrase. We want the truth about our work, as long as truth is praise. It gives me great pleasure now to welcome John Bassett McCleary.
W.K. Bassett was born February 15th, 1987 in Oakland, California. His name at birth was Willard Kenneth Bassett, much to his disgust. He was called Bill by many who knew him, and W.K. by others. W.K. for Willard Kenneth. W.K.'s parents were Carrie Hazeltine Bassett, daughter of Dr. William Hazeltine and Jeannie Town Hazeltine of Los Angeles. His father was James Madison Bassett. James Madison Bassett was born in Indiana in 1930. He came to California in 1950.
18.
You're right. That's the first mistake you caught me on. 1830, and he came to California in 1850. James was at one time the editor and publisher of the Los Angeles Herald, editor of the Golden Era in San Francisco, and editorial writer on the San Francisco Chronicle and Sacramento Bee. While running the Golden Era, Bret Harte worked for James Madison as a linotype operator. And there are some accounts of the fact that Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain also worked on that newspaper as a linotype operator. It is also said that Bret Harte owes his career in some way to Carrie Bassett, my grandmother, who transcribed some of his work and sent it to the publications in the eastern United States. So apparently she helped him along in his career. James Madison Bassett reportedly was also the secretary to Senator Leland Stanford, the founder of Stanford University, in the early years of the railroad. And when Collis P. Huntington, who was also one of the members of the group that started most of the railroads in the West, when Huntington ousted Stanford from control of the railroad companies, James Madison Bassett lost his job. He was not very happy about that, and he spent pretty much the rest of his life as an annoyance to Collis Huntington, because when he became a columnist, when James Madison Bassett became a columnist, he wrote many articles about Huntington's shady business and political dealings. James published the Old Pard Letters, which received national recognition by exposing Huntington's corruptions. That's one of the more prominent aspects of James Madison Bassett's background, was the Old Pard Letters about Huntington. James W.K. Bassett, my father, began his own newspaper career at age 12 by producing a weekly newspaper, in quotes. It was produced in his backyard from discarded type that came from the Oakland Tribune, where his father was working at the time. By age 19, which if you use your mathematics was 1906, W.K. was a cub reporter on the San Francisco Chronicle, and he wrote newspaper copy during the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire. One of the stories tells of watching the newspaper call printing press fall several floors through the building into the basement. And when they rebuilt the building over that area, they left the presses there. They're still in the basement. In October 1907, W.K. got a job on the staff of the Oakland Tribune. Between 1907 and 1919, W.K. worked on newspapers between Modesto and San Francisco. I believe he worked on the Sacramento Bee at a time and so on. For a short period of time in 1914, he tried his hand at something other than journalism or politics, which were the only other things that I know of that he did. He made a stab at insurance salesmanship. WK holds a sales record that still stands to this day in that company. After 4 months of work, he sold only one policy, and that was to his brother, who never paid the premiums. By the time he left that occupation, he was confirmed as the least productive salesman that that company had ever had. But then, sales was not his forte. He had ink in his blood, newspaper ink. In 1919, WK was on the staff of the San Francisco Bulletin. As the story goes, and there are many stories about WK, some of course apocryphal by this time, but I've read accounts on many of these stories in 2 or 3 different sources, so I'm pretty sure of this. As the story goes, one payday after celebrating with drink and gambling, WK found himself on a boat to Hawaii. That was in 1919. It was his first trip to Hawaii, and he stayed there until 1924. He worked on different newspapers there, taught journalism in school, and also was elected to the Honolulu Board of Supervisors. And he started this short-lived newspaper called the Honolulu Times. In 1924, WK returned to the mainland the way he often did, abruptly. It seems that he did quite a few of his moves quite abruptly. The one going to Hawaii, he had a job, and I believe he had a family, and he just left for Hawaii at the time. In 1924, when he got back to California, he worked in San Francisco at the Call newspaper for about a year, and then moved to Carmel in 1926. I'm not sure whether it probably wasn't his first time ever being in Carmel, but I believe this was the first time he came to live, 1926. On May 11th, 1926, he published the first issue of the Carmel Cymbal. The offices were in Bert Herron's building, the Seven Arts building, which still stands at the corner of Ocean and Lincoln Avenue. And there's a courtyard on Lincoln, and in that courtyard was where the Cymbal first was. And it was there off and on for quite a while. The first issue of the Carmel Cymbal is right here. And volume 1, number 1, May 11, 1926. And on the staff of the Cymbal, the contributors to this issue were Dora C. Hagemeyer, Talbert Jocelyn, Blanche C. Matthias, Robert Wells Ritchies, and Dorothea Castle. Now, during this time, as noted by the fact that she's actually one of the contributors to this newspaper, WK met Dorothea Castle, and they were married. I don't know the exact date of their marriage. If anyone here is aware of that, please let me know. And they had a son, Oliver, on May 5th, 1927. Now, the name Dorothea Castle might be familiar to you because she co-wrote with Daisy Bostick, Carmel at Work and Play. It's a book which was on sale. As a matter of fact, there's an ad for it in this particular issue, May 1926, and is still in print and for sale today. W.K. Bassett suspended publication of the Herald, of the Cymbal in 1928 for a period of time. This was something that you'll see was a pattern in his life up until his later life. He would flit here and there. And he suspended the Cymbal for a time and went elsewhere. But there are also many stories of him just deciding to go up to San Francisco and see his friends for a couple of weeks, and not publishing the magazine, the paper at all. There are some holes in the publication, and people say, well, we can't find this paper, and it might be that it was never published. Between 1928 and 1934, WK was in Oakland, Honolulu, Boston, and Providence, Rhode Island, mostly working on newspapers and so on. There's several very interesting stories during this time. One of them, which could be true, could be false. He was interviewing the Tunney fight. Anybody know? Tunney and Dempsey, that's right. And he was interviewing Dempsey, and his son Oliver was there, who was 6 or 7 years old at the time. And one of the other people there said, "Well, what do you think? Don't you think your father could beat up Dempsey? Do you think they should have a couple of rounds?" And Oliver said, after a few moments of thought, he said, "I don't think my father would want to." We know that WK was working on the Providence, Rhode Island Journal in 1932 because he sent some publications, some articles back here that were published in the Carmelite, which Lincoln Steffens had a part in the Carmelite here. And this particular issue is October 13, 1932. And WK did several articles in that paper. Here's one of them. And it states down here that he was in Providence, Rhode Island at the time. Also, as I say, he was in Boston and was, I believe, at the Boston Herald. Then W.K. Bassett returned to Carmel in 1934. 1934. Now I'm in 19s. I don't have to worry about the 18s anymore. Okay. He returned to start another newspaper, which I don't have any copies of, but we have copies in the library here, called The Controversy. And those of you who know much about W.K. Bassett, you know that that's a perfect name for a newspaper for him, because he always seemed to be in the midst of controversy. There's only 2 issues of Controversy here in the library, and it could have been a shorter period of time that it ran as 2 issues. It was a monthly, and there was 2 months that it ran that we know of. That first edition was published October 25, 1934. In 1935, W.K. began working with Ella Winters and Lincoln Steffens on the Pacific Weekly. And he was the editor of the Pacific Weekly for a time. Because of his work in this paper, he was later accused by a congressional committee of being a communist. I don't have the copy here with me that has the quote from him that's saying that he's not a communist. But it's very interesting in that he stated that he was not a communist, but he believed in the First Amendment, freedom of speech, so that he didn't care what side of the political wheel you were on, he would allow you to print in his paper, and that's how he became aligned with communists, because he allowed them to print things in his paper. He states that he was never a communist, but during that period of time, it was quite popular to be. In 1926, February 1926, February 26, 1935, excuse me, for 5 months until July 24, 1935, he resurrected the Carmel Cymbal. That's a period of 6 months. Gives you another clue as to how he worked. The offices of the Carmel Cymbal at that time were in the bell tower court. The bell tower still is there. The bell is not there anymore. But that's on the southeastern corner of 7th and San Carlos. And the offices were in the very back of the building. I will show you a photograph of him in one of the offices. His offices particularly are now occupied by Ailing House termite control. And there's an art gallery on 7th, which was the printing shop. And at one time, I believe it was also the pine cone. I believe the pine cone was printed there as well. That's on the southeastern corner of 7th and San Carlos. Then he took a little bit of time off, and approximately a year, and he resurrected the Carmel Cymbal in large format. The early cymbal was in this smaller format, and there were a lot of, this is a Hestwood. Are you familiar with Robert Hestwood? This is a Hestwood cut, linoleum cut probably, and he did a lot of that kind of artwork in this publication. Here's a Jesse Arms Botke woodcut in the paper. There were a lot of, once in a while he would print with color, and the covers were very striking, he says. Here's November 3rd, 1926, and all of them using local artists. And if you're ever interested in perusing them, the library, Arlene Hess is here 4 days a week, 5 days a week, 4 days a week, Tuesday through Friday, from 1 o'clock until 6 o'clock. 5, I'm sorry. See, it's good to have somebody here. And you can look at these. Then it was printed in the larger format. This is a Christmas issue, 1940 Christmas issue. These are my own books that I acquired from my mother. Some of them were given to her. Some of them. This one was given to, I believe, this one was actually given to my mother, Pauline Meeks, at the time. She was the advertising manager of the paper at that time. And some of them, oddly enough, these were found in Hollywood in a bookstore by Lucille Keister. I'm sure that you know Lucille. And when she saw them, she bought them for 50 cents a piece or something like that, and gave them to my mother. Shortly after, well, not shortly, 3 or 4 years, during this period of time, up until 1940, the paper was continued to be printed in the Bell Tower Court area. Also, the Carmel Printers were there at the same time, and he had some interest in Carmel Printers. In October 4th, 1940, the newspaper offices were moved to Dolores Street Now there's some interesting confusion as to where the offices were, because the masthead says Dolores near 8th, but I have a photograph, which I will show you, that shows a building which I know to be between Ocean and 7th. And unless they change the numbers on the streets, which I don't think that ever happened, there's a discrepancy there. But from 1940 until its last printing, the symbol was on Dolores. Some say between Ocean and 8th, Ocean and 7th, and some say near 8th. The last issue of the Carmel Cymbal was printed April 18th, 1941. So there were basically 3 different incarnations. There was the one in the 1920s, 26 to 28. Then in the 1930s, 34, actually 35, for 6 months. And then in 1936 to 41. And on the date, April 18th, 1941, which was the last issue of this Carmel Cymbal, had been sold to Rick Maston, or Richard Maston, who is the father of Rick Maston and Warren Maston, who you possibly know. And he, at that time, he had been an employee of the pine cone, had tried to buy the pine cone. That's Richard Maston. And the owners at the time would not sell the pine cone, so he started his own newspaper called the Maston Gazette. And then shortly thereafter, he purchased the pine cone from WK. And for a time, the newspaper was published with the masthead, the Carmel Cymbal and Maston Gazette. Rick Maston, Richard Maston, or Dick Maston, as some people know him, died very shortly thereafter, probably within a year, 1941, I believe. And this is where my information is a little sketchy. I don't know exactly whether it was sold to the pine cone, how it was sold to the pine cone, when it was sold to the pine cone. But for a time, the pine cone actually owned the symbol name, the Carmel Cymbal name, and there are issues of the pine cone which say Pine Cone Cymbal. W.K. Bassett moved to San Francisco between 1940 and 1945. He was in San Francisco, and he worked on the copy desk of the San Francisco News at that time. When W.K. had been in Hawaii in the 1920s, he worked with a gentleman who was a politician by the name of John Wilson. And John Wilson wrote W.K. a letter in 1945 asking him to come to Hawaii, Honolulu specifically, to help him with some of his political activities. So W.K. went to Hawaii for the last time, leaving Carmel and San Francisco in 1945. The exact date I'm not sure. There's several little anecdotes about when he arrived. There was a newspaper reporter there waiting for the boat to arrive, not knowing that W.K. was coming on the boat. And W.K. stepped off the boat and walked up to him to shake hands, and the man backed away. And he said, "I won't shake hands with you until you give me the $10 I loaned to you in 1927. W.K. was a very, very good editorial. copywriter. And anybody who knew his work will tell you that. But he was not a very good businessman. And he always seemed to be just this far away from disaster, economic disaster. But he, as I say, he was well respected as a newspaperman. When W.K. went to Hawaii at this point, he started working with John Wilson, who eventually became the mayor of Honolulu in 1947, actually. And at that time, Hawaii was not a state, so as the mayor of Honolulu, he was in essence the governor of the state of Hawaii, or that territory. W.K. was very active in politics, particularly dealing with the agricultural workers. He was a radical supporter of field workers and very critical of the big four fruit companies because they were treating their workers very, very near like slaves at that time. He is responsible, directly responsible for the unions in Hawaii. And if you speak to any Hawaiians who were around at that period of time and you mention his name, that he's almost godlike in that he gave them an economic base. They were able to make a living working for the fruit companies. On January 17th, 1954, he moved to Hawaii in 48. January 17th, 1954, W.K. was struck by a car in Honolulu, and he died January 26th, 1954. I'm sorry, I break up whenever I think about that. I have several things that I would like to show you here and read to you. It's going to be very difficult because I don't have something to put them up on. You might. This is my wife, Joan Jeffers McCleary. First, I want to read these. These are bills and correspondence with one up here is Blake Moffat Town Paper Company, which still exists today. And he's ordering a ream of Vulcan book rough finish, which I presume this is it right here. As a matter of fact, this issue was most likely printed on the first ream of Vulcan book rough finish, because this was dated. Well, this was dated May 1927, so this is probably the kind of paper he was using. He also, the Intertype Corporation, notes that he has insurance on Model 5 composing machine. And over here, the Intertype Corporation, a communication about W.K. wanting a 10-point Kennetonian with italic and small caps, and this is some of the type that was used in these publications. So it was Vulcan book, rough finish was the paper. He had a Model 5 composing machine, and he used Kennetonian. Can you pronounce that name for me? Kentonian type. Several interesting things about W.K. He was, you can hold these pictures if you I might pass them around if you're interested. He, this is him in his office here. This is in the southwest corner of 7th and San Carlos. This office, I've been in this office. I finally, after 2 years of searching, I found these windows. and they're in the back office of the Alien House termite business office. Yes. WK, my mother told me that WK was one of these people who could, because there'd be a deadline, he would, oftentimes rather than type it out on a typewriter and then go to the linotype machine, he would actually compose on the linotype machine. And if you know anything about newspaper, that's very difficult to do because you are actually typing onto the lead, which doesn't go into the press, but it's the next step before it goes into the press. You're cutting out a middleman. He was a very good writer, and he also had a very good term. Oh boy, I love it when I do that. A command of the English language. My mother said, and this is another apocryphal, possibly, that he tried to learn a new word every day. Now that wasn't just learn how to spell it, but he learned how to spell it, he learned its derivation, and also how to use it in a sentence. That would be very difficult to do, but I'm sure that she meant that he tried very hard to learn the English language. We can do that if you want. This photograph was taken on one of the last days of the last Carmel Cymbal in 1941. He's moving out of this building. This building is in between Ocean and 7th, excuse me. There used to be a liquor store there. Now there's 2 antique stores. It's right across from the little park. And on the last issue it says, "Goodbye, Carmel. God help you now." If you'd like, you can pass that around. Here's another copy of the symbol. This is July 12th, 1940. This one, I would have to look inside to find out, but if you'd like, I'll take a look later. We have one issue, as a matter of fact. You were looking at that. You made a copy of it, I believe, that shows the first date of the Bach Festival. It was 1927 or something like that. I'm not sure. How's that? This is the 6th annual. So that was 1940, so it would be 1934 or something. That's right, 1934. And we have an issue of that. There's a few things that I want to write about him. WK is one of the few people in journalism that had as much written about him as he wrote himself. He was very controversial, had a sense of humor. He did. I've read things from people who were arch enemies of his, who said that he always did his knife thrusts with humor. It was a little easier for them to take. Let me read a few things written about him. This is in the Honolulu newspaper in 1968. I've got several things written about him in 1960s. Years after he died, 1968, Honolulu Sunday Star Bulletin and Advertising. And this gentleman wrote an article about WK, 1968, which was, I believe it's 13 years after he died. Martin Flavin said, and many of you know who Martin Flavin was. Martin Flavin said of the Carmel Cymbal, says, that, of the symbol, he said, it was quite a newspaper. The only trouble with it was that no matter what the story, the real headline was WK. Another quote is, WK was a slight, wiry, nattily dressed man with a sharp nose, eyes, tongue, and beard. He was quick with the quip and composed limericks for his friends as easily as he wrote attacks on other people. He was a great guy, Hawaii's first real dissenter. It might be added that any political figure or observer of the time has his own Bassett story. Each of them came in contact with him or were confronted by him in one way or another. Here's another copy which I particularly like, and you can see that I like it. I've moved it around a lot and it's falling apart. But this was the Ponchong issue. There's a story about this. The Pinecone did an issue on somebody who was a real estate broker in Carmel, and so my father decided that he would do one on Ponchong, who was like as far away from a real estate broker as you can imagine. And this was the whole issue. The whole issue dealt with Ponchong, and all of the advertisement had Chinese characters. And I later on, I found Ponchong, met Ponchong, and had him sign his name. So I found Ponchong. And yeah, he lived in Pacific Grove or New Monterey up until only maybe 10 or so years ago. I believe he died at 90 years old. Yes. W.K. Bassett, as I said, had almost as much written about him as he wrote himself about other people. For a period of time, there were a lot of things written about him in the 50 and 60. 50, it's now going to be going on 60 years ago in Carmel. And these are bits and pieces. Bonnie Gottschor has written a lot about him in her communications. Also in the Coast Weekly, John Thompson, when he was working there, wrote a whole series of articles about people in Carmel. And here's a rendition of what W.K. looked like. Somebody once said that they were using his appearance derisively, and they said that goatee, and W.K. said it's not a goatee, it's a Van Dyke. Which apparently he wore almost every photograph I've seen of him has the Van Dyke. In this article here, Bonnie Gottschor, it all began when council candidate W.K. Bassett, editor of the Carmel Cymbal, pledged to do everything in his power to prevent Carmel from becoming a second Santa Cruz. And this, of course, made the people in Santa Cruz mad, so they started throwing stones at him. Archibald MacPhail, editor and publisher of the Carmel Pinecone at this particular time, and the date is not, I'm not sure, it was in the 40s something, wrote this about W.K. He has a deep and abiding, and this man did not like W.K., by the way, so this gives you some idea of the respect he had for him. He has a deep and abiding love for Carmel, W.K. has. This love for Carmel is This love is for Carmel as a residential village, and those who are anxious to maintain the spirit of old Carmel can count on count upon Bassett to fight for the retention of that ideal. Bassett now recognizes that his job is no longer just to tear down, but to help carry the burden of building up. We don't mean that he's becoming respectable, for he will always be a wild and woolly editor. This was the time when W.K. was running for the city council of Carmel, and he was defeated. This might be one reason why he was defeated here. This is 50 years ago today, 1937, June 18th, 1937. It was written in 1987. 50 years ago today. Fisticuffs on Ocean Avenue. To the great edification of spectators, but happily with no great damage to either to themselves, Police Commissioner Joseph A. Berg and one W.K. Bassett engaged in fisticuffs on Ocean Avenue, not far from the post office, Friday afternoon. Bassett is said to be the editor of Carmel Weekly newspaper. Bystanders who heard the preliminary arguments leading up to the exchange of blows reported that Berg appeared to be taking exception to something Bassett had said about him in his newspaper. Or not so much what was said, but that the editor did not say it like a gentleman. So the police commissioner, and some of you are familiar with Joseph A. Berg, and my father actually came to blows on the street of Carmel. In this article written by John Thompson about some of the, this is actually written about some of the liberal or communist activities in Carmel during the 1930s. And W.K.'s name is mentioned. And again, I say, W.K. flatly denied ever being a communist. And those of you who know him know that if he had been a communist, he would have said he had been. But he flatly denied it. But he said over and over again that they had a right to speak out, so he was always giving them a platform to say what they wanted to say. Here's another thing if you can take a look at if you want. When the pine cone died its last time in April of 41, the Carmel pine cone, it was the largest story on the front of the pine cone. It was the largest story. When the cymbal died, did I say? When the cymbal died for the last time in 41, the pine cone thought enough of to make it their major story, and they called it, or W.K. Bassett, the stormy petrel of Carmel journalism. Also, this is the Carmel Cymbal and the Madison Gazette on the day after, or the week that W.K. sold the paper to Richard Master. And here's an article written by W.K. about about finally ending pine cones. Rains. That's why I have a wife to keep me straight on these things. About the demise of the cymbal down there is on the Master Gazette. Pine cone. And this can pass that around. He was a very interesting person, as I said, not just in Carmel, but in San Francisco, in Hawaii. Here's several photographs. This was actually in the San Francisco Chronicle, an article about him, and he's redoing the paper, making marks on it. It says, "Beloved and sometimes hated W.K. Bassett, who runs at top speed the Carmel Cymbal, that brightest of weekly newspapers, already a legend in the city rooms of newspapers from coast to coast and Hawaii. Bassett returns to his native Carmel to crusade for the maintenance of her simpler charms. His opposition to tourist ballyhoo is additional evidence that among editors he is unique. This is a very interesting photograph. This particular photograph I've had all my life. My mother had it. There's another, the library has another rendition of this photograph taken moments before or moments after. And another rendition of this photograph is also to be found in the El Fornayo restaurant, which is in the Mission Inn. Pine Inn. Thank you. In the Pine Inn, the rotunda, the glass room there, if you walk in from the patio area and turn to your left, you'll see this photograph blown up. It was probably in the 1920s because this outfit, you'll see people were in +4s. The hat was probably the only thing which was not normal wear at the time. Also of note in this photograph, my mother said, this woman here is his mother, Carrie Bassett. And this gentleman here is Stanton Delaplane. And Stanton Delaplane worked for my grandfather in at least one of his newspapers, and worked with W.K. in the newspapers in San Francisco. And this is a very striking photograph of him. As a matter of fact, this is the only time I've ever seen a photograph without the goatee, or excuse me, this photograph here in 1920. And this was written to my mother. And this also is sort of a good example of his character. Pauline, no matter how arrogant he may be, remember he adores you. W.K. Bassett. I'm going to show them the other side of this first. When W.K. went to Hawaii, as I said, he became the administrative assistant to eventually the man who was the mayor of Honolulu. And John Wilson, who was that man, the mayor, was quite a bit older and became quite ill. And at times he was in the hospital. And at times W.K. Bassett was the mayor of Honolulu. He worked functioned as the mayor of Honolulu. He also continued to write in newspapers. And so he was a very well-known figure in Hawaii at the time of his death. As a matter of fact, this was the newspaper the day that he died. And that was January 26, 1954. If you know, many newspapers will not put anything above their masthead. And it was a big enough story at the time that they put it above the masthead. This is a booklet. This is just the cover of it, which is a journalism scholarship that I haven't checked, but it might possibly still be in existence in Hawaii for any high school kids who want to go on to journalism. And this was started by people after his death. I can pass this one on too. Why don't we go this one? This one here. And you can spend. How much time do we have?
Sure.
How's that?
15 minutes or so.
Okay. The initial, when he was hit by the car, this is Honolulu Star, one of the papers he worked for at one time. This was the article written the night that he was hit by the car. And it shows dent in the front of the car and so on and so forth. He lived for about 8 days. Yes, I guess I can circulate this. I want to hand out something before all of you go. I'd like to hand out this piece, and this is it in the paper on July 24th, 1935 was the end of one of the incarnations of the symbol. And it's called Fragments Found on a Tombstone. And I'm going to give you each a handout, because if you read this and not look at the date, you will probably realize that it could be something written today. People have, for years, commented on the way that the Carmel lifestyle has changed. And he was not the only, or maybe not even the first person to fight for the hometown spirit of Carmel, but he was one of the most vocal during the period of time that he was on the Monterey Peninsula in Carmel. So we're handing out this little poem that he wrote about the demise of Carmel. Now, okay, I knew that was going to come up. The first question is the one that I knew was going to come up. I knew that I was going to have to field it at one point. My mother she's gone now, Pauline Meeks, and she went to school in Monterey High School, lived in Carmel. She graduated from Monterey High School in 1929, and she was on the staff of the Monterey newspaper, the Monterey High School newspaper, along with Paul Zatchis. You know Paul Zatchis. And he was editor, and she was in charge of advertising. Well, in order to print the newspaper, the Monterey High School newspaper, and this was in probably 1926 or 27, they came to Carmel and printed it on W.K. Bassett's presses. So in 1920, I believe 1926, my mother and W.K. met. She worked on the paper. He printed the paper for the Monterey High School. Later, when he came back in 1935, she began working for him. She worked on the newspaper as an advertising, in the advertising area. Also, she wrote, and I've got some documentation of this, she wrote a column which, if you are interested in the history of Carmel at all, and you want to see, they've got all of the Carmel symbols on microfilm. There's a column here which my mother wrote for some years, which was called Newsgravities. And what this basically was a social column. Very short little things. Let me just read one of them here. It just happens to have Bassett in it. Mr. and Mrs. R.H. Bassett of Hollywood are visiting Carmel. Mr. Bassett composes and arranges musical scores for the motion picture. He is a son of Mrs. Carrie H. Bassett. Mrs. Carrie H. Bassett is my grandmother. So R.H. Bassett is my uncle, basically. But we'll go through here, and up here here's Martha Beard, here's William Gaskin, Dudley Carter, all of these people, and Mr. and Mrs. Robertson Jeffers returned today from visiting. from a visit of 5 weeks to Taos, where they have been the guests of Mrs. Mabel Dodge Lewin. That's a very interesting story. We could go even further with that story because Mrs. Lewin got involved in a lot of relationships. So if you're interested in the history of Carmel on that level, which is a very sort of social little things, people who come to dinner from San Francisco to visit someone, they're in here. To finish your story, when my mother and he started their relationship, I'm not sure. But I have photographs of them in Santa Barbara together on the beach in 1936. He was married to someone else at the time. And my mother, Pauline Meeks, and W.K. were never married. I was born in 1942, just about the time he left Carmel. And I have a birth certificate to prove it and all that. That's neither here nor there. I have just fairly recently become quite interested in the history because I am also a journalist, and I have dug into these things quite deeply. I knew that question was going to come up. That's the answers. Any other questions or comments? As I say, if you have any information, you don't have to relate it to me all now. If you have any information you're interested in comparing notes or anything like that, please let me know, because I do want to know as much, and I'll tell you. Yes?
When did you grow your first Van Dyke?
Probably in I've got a photograph or two in 1984, I believe. No, it was before that. 1978. 1978.
Sure look like you did.
I've been told that many, many times, yes. And I'm proud of that. Yes?
Do you have any idea of the relationship between Bassett and Perry Newberry, who was also selected in journalism?
Yes. Arlene asked what the relationship between Bassett and Perry Newberry was. They were, of course, in a very small town together for a very long period of time, and Perry Newberry was also in journalism, but he was also in the theater. I don't know specifically. I know that he wrote about Perry Newberry's play productions, and they probably socialized. I know for sure that W.K. was a very close friend of Custer's, Edward Custer. And Edward Custer and Perry Newberry did not get along too well because they were actually competing. Edward Custer had the Golden Bough, and Perry Newberry had the Forest Theater, and they socialized, but they also had a few things that were not in common with. But I'm not specifically sure. I could probably read in if I read deeply enough, I could find some things that he wrote about Perry Newberry, I'm sure. Any other questions, comments, or yes?
I know Jack London was before W.K., but was W.K. interested in Jack London's politics or ideas, or did it never come up?
Well, I don't know specifically whether they ever met. There's a good chance that they did. W.K. knew Robinson Jeffers quite well and spent time with his home. And I know Jack London did as well. To be quite frank, my father was a screaming liberal, if not a communist, which he said he wasn't. He didn't have the card that said he was. But a lot of his friends were the liberals of this area at that period of time. And so he probably, there's a good chance that he knew him personally, but I specifically don't know that. And these are things, as I go along, I will find out, because I hope to someday read all of his articles in the newspaper, but that's going to take quite a while. Any others? Yes.
I believe I know the artist of this picture of Bach.
Do you?
Yeah, I think it's Emil Norman, who is still in town.
Emil Norman?
Yes, and he's in the phone book.
Oh, great.
He
Wonderful.
may be somebody who might want to call.
There used to be a poster of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
If you go over to the Sunset Center, I'm sure that they have a copy of it hanging somewhere in the Bach
Probably.
Festival office.
I know that I've seen that elsewhere too, not just on
And
there.
Emil's still around. So
Yes.
Your father was walking across Avenue 5.
Toward the ocean. In Hawaii, they use directions like that. It means one way is anybody else Makai?
Malka and Mackay. Malka to the hills and Mackay to the ocean.
Makai is to the ocean. Yes. I live in Monterey. I've never lived in Carmel specifically, but I was born in San Francisco, 42, moved back to the Monterey Peninsula in 51, 52, around then. And I've maintained a home on the Monterey Peninsula ever since. I've been off and on, been in Los Angeles for 10 years in the Central Valley. But it's been my physical, spiritual home all my life. And although I say I'm a third generation Carmelite, nobody in my family was born here. But my grandfather built one of the first houses in Carmel Woods, one of the stone houses up there, right behind the statue. My mother graduated from Monterey High School in 1929, and they were living up there at that time. And my, I've been here off and on, so I hedge when I say I'm third generation Carmel. But
You should mention your exhibit.
oh, thank you. I will do that.
Yeah, I was going to say, why don't you modestly tell folks about how we've been reading your work in the Herald for the past, what?
As I said, I consider myself a journalist. I have had a feature in the Monterey Herald, Sunday section of the Herald, for about 2.5 years, which was called Peninsula People. And when I came back to the Monterey Peninsula, I was so overjoyed to be back that I wanted to do something to celebrate that. So I produced this series of photographs and biographies of local people, all the way from the great to the interesting, old and young and new and old, and quite a few Carmelites, quite a few people from all around the peninsula. And it is now on the walls of the Monterey Museum of Art. It's called Peninsula People. And it's I can say without embarrassment that I think it's a great show, mainly because it has wonderful people on the wall.
It is a great
Yeah,
show.
they were in the paper, just small photographs with a very small bios. But in the museum, there are larger photographs in the bio. It's a very interesting collection of local people. Yes?
I was a resident here in the mid-30s going to school, and I remember quite clearly the symbol, and I think the words controversy and criticism were the key words. And
Right.
Criticism was, I think, always leveled at the city council and the mayor form. There are a couple of personal questions I'd like to ask. They really don't relate totally to Mr. Bassett, but we've been trying to solve them. One of them is this: you've introduced Pon Chung,
Yes.
and it strikes a tremendous note in my memory bank, but I don't remember what the role of Pon Chung was in Carmel.
Well, some people might know better than I'll just say what I know about him. He was, number one, I believe at times he worked as a dishwasher. At times he might have worked in one of the laundries here. He was a volunteer fireman. He was made an honorary volunteer fireman because he went to every fire in the city of Carmel. Some people actually suggest that he may have started some of them. Just because he was always the first person there. He was never actually a volunteer fireman. He worked with them, he helped them sometimes hold the hose and so on and so forth. But he was just one of our characters, basically.
He was, everybody in town knew him.
Oh, yeah.
I remember that.
Yeah. He was just one of the characters.
Other question that I'm trying to solve with some of my library friends that maybe some of you can help. One of the meeting places in those days, meaning the mid-30s, was Sadie's Restaurant on then the north side of Ocean Avenue.
Right.
Sadie was, I believe at that time, married to an architect named Milton somebody.
Latham.
Latham.
Bill Latham.
And he designed, I believe, the fire station right over here. But the question is this: Sadie of the restaurant used, I believe, her stage name when she was conducting her business at the restaurant. Nobody can seem to remember what that stage name was.
You know, I don't know, but have you done any research in the symbol?
On it. There's something lingering if somebody ever.
The symbol might,
finds out.
is there anyone here who might know? One of the, I was talking to Cole Weston a couple of weeks ago. You said controversy. Cole Weston was a high school kid up here in 1930s, and he said that he remembers Bill Bassett and the symbol because that's where the high school kids used to go and congregate after school oftentimes, and they actually worked and helped him put out the newspaper because there was radical politics going on there. It was like, it was exciting. It was like they were involved, they were getting involved in. And he said that a bunch of the kids used to go there and help him put out the paper because there was never a dull moment, probably.
We had a Mr. Duxbury when I first moved here, and he was a card-carrying communist.
There were quite a few.
He bragged about it.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'm sure, as I said, that if W.K. had been, he would not lie about it. He was not the kind of person that would lie about something. But he was, of course, Lincoln Steffens was brought up before the Un-American activities, and I think at least W.K.'s name was mentioned. We're getting close to the ending of this. Again, I would like to tell you that if you have anything that you would like to tell me about WK, about the symbol, or if you want to exchange anything that I know, please get in touch with me. Arlene will be able to tell you how to reach me. I don't have my cards with me.
And thank you all for coming. I want to invite you to have some refreshments. And don't forget to move your car. It's getting towards 12. And please join us next month, the last Monday in March. Cecil Wally will be here to talk to us about the themes in Robinson Jeffers' poetry. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.